Okay, so, you've been sending over a lot of interesting material on defense procurement. And
Absolutely.
today we're going to kind of unpack a really key element of all of that.
Yeah.
And it's Section 307 of the Forge D Act.
Very significant.
Yeah. And think of it this way.
Okay.
This is kind of like an insider's look at how the DoD is changing the way it buys things, right? Making things faster, more efficient.
Yeah.
And we're going to dive into the act itself.
Yeah.
And give you a clear understanding, hopefully, of these new spending limits, the thinking behind them, and what you, the listener, should be keeping an eye on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let's get into it.
So we're really diving deep into how the DoD's procurement processes are being reshaped by this section of the Act, Section 307.
Okay.
And what's fascinating to me is the scale of the increases to these really fundamental procurement thresholds.
Yeah.
It really signals a pretty big shift, I think, in their approach to how they're doing things.
Right. So let's nail down some specifics, like the numbers and stuff.
Okay.
The simplified acquisition threshold going from $250,000 to $10 million.
Yeah, a huge jump.
A huge jump. So to put that in perspective, what kinds of things were, typically purchased in that $250,000 range before, to give us a sense of the scale now with $10 million?
Right. So you're looking at things like maybe certain equipment upgrades, specialized software licenses, perhaps for a smaller unit or even some smaller scale research and development contracts.
Oh, wow.
So it gives you a sense of the level of acquisition that we'll now see a much more streamlined process.
Right, right.
And then you've got the micro purchase threshold
Okay.
going from $10,000 to $100,000. That's, again, a massive increase for those smaller day-to-day needs.
Wow.
And then, of course, the small business reservation
Right.
seeing a big boost up to $500,000. So these aren't just little tweaks. These are big, deliberate changes.
Yeah. So what's the driving force behind this? Why these dramatic shifts now?
Well, this hasn't come out of nowhere. I mean, the sources you sent actually trace this back to the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of '94,
Okay.
which originally set that simplified acquisition threshold way back then at $100,000. And of course, it's been adjusted incrementally over time up to that $250,000 mark.
Right, right.
And as you mentioned, that micro purchase limit saw an increase more recently back in 2016.
So it's been sort of creeping upwards, and now this is a real,
Acceleration.
yeah.
Exactly. And, groups like the GAO and all kinds of studies, discover.diatic.mil, even defense.gov records.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive kind of
Historical look.
yeah.
Have all been saying that these limits were getting more and more restrictive.
Okay.
And the argument is they were really hindering the acquisition of, necessary innovative solutions.
Okay.
Because the thresholds just didn't keep up with rising costs and the growing complexity of everything the DoD needs. And the fact that this is a recommendation from the Forged Act, which incorporates input from, places like the Defense Science Board and innovation.defense.gov,
Right.
all suggests that there's pretty broad agreement that a bigger change was needed
Right.
to create more agility in defense procurement.
Right. So, I mean, if I can sort of summarize, you're saying that the rationale is to boost speed, improve efficiency, get access to better tech.
Yeah, more quickly, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are the intended positive outcomes of these new thresholds?
So the documentation actually lists 5
Okay.
key anticipated benefits.
Yeah.
First one, that $10 million simplified acquisition threshold should really speed up those bigger purchases.
Right.
Because they'll be subject to, less regulatory oversight.
Right.
Second, the $100,000 micro purchase threshold,
Right.
that's going to simplify so many of those smaller transactions.
Okay.
All that routine stuff, supplies, services.
Right. Yeah.
That could cut through a lot of red tape.
So streamline the smaller stuff to free up resources for the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Okay. Got it.
Third, raising that small business reservation to $500,000.
Right.
That should really open up a lot of opportunities for small businesses.
Okay.
Allow them to compete for a much bigger chunk of those DoD contracts.
Right.
And fourth, by aligning these spending limits with, what things actually cost today.
Right.
The expectation is a reduction in that administrative burden.
Right.
Which makes sense.
Right. So efficiency gains kind of across the board.
Across the board, yeah.
And the fifth one.
The fifth benefit is all about flexibility.
Okay.
For rapid capability fielding.
Right.
Which really supports innovation.
Right.
The idea is that higher thresholds, less cumbersome processes,
Yeah.
the DoD can be much more nimble, adopt and deploy new technologies much faster.
Okay. And I mean, these all sound like positive goals, but are there potential downsides, things we should be, aware of, heads-up areas? Because, I mean, big changes like this rarely come without some complications, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the documentation does highlight 5 areas where there could be negative impacts.
Okay.
First, those higher thresholds,
Right.
right? They could definitely lead to less oversight.
Okay.
And of course, that raises concerns about the possibility of wasteful spending.
Right.
When you have purchases of up to $10 million with fewer hurdles,
Yeah.
things could go off track.
So more money potentially spent with less scrutiny, that's a big one to consider.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. What else?
Second, that big increase in the micro purchase threshold, up to $100,000,
Right.
could put a real strain on budget tracking
Okay.
and, I guess, fiscal visibility.
Right.
Because while it simplifies each individual transaction, right, all those small dollar ones,
Right.
the cumulative effect of a lot of these higher value micro purchases might actually make it harder to see the big picture
Wow.
of where the money's actually going.
Right.
And third, while the focus on small businesses is a good thing, raising that reservation to $500,000 could actually shut out some larger companies that are really capable,
Right.
potentially limiting competition and access to expertise that only those bigger firms have.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, so it's not just about giving more contracts to small businesses. It could actually incentivize new specialized companies
Oh, wow.
to pop up. And maybe that leads to more niche innovation in defense, but those bigger companies might need to change how they subcontract things.
So finding that balance, promoting small business, but not, losing those capabilities of the larger players.
Finding that balance is going to be key.
Okay, got it.
The fourth potential issue is, that emphasis on speed, on rapid acquisition.
Right.
Might mean we bypass some of those thorough vetting and quality assurance steps.
Right.
And that could end up compromising the quality, even the security of what we're buying.
Right. Speed shouldn't come at the cost of, effectiveness.
Exactly.
Right.
And then fifth, these much higher spending limits. They could really overwhelm the people we have doing contracting.
Okay.
So if they're suddenly dealing with much bigger transactions, but under, simpler rules,
Right.
their workload explodes, things could actually slow down.
Okay.
So it's a potential bottleneck.
Interesting. So it sounds like the DoD is kind of anticipating these potential issues, right?
Yeah.
Because the document mentions mitigation strategies.
Right.
So what's the game plan? How do they address these possible downsides?
They've got 5 main strategies.
Okay.
First, to deal with the less oversight, they're going to do a lot more random audits.
Okay.
To make sure we're still being accountable, even with these higher thresholds.
Right.
Second, for all those micro purchases,
Yeah.
they're going to, improve how they track and report on those.
Okay.
So we can still see where the money's going, even with these higher limits.
Okay.
Third, to balance all the focus on small businesses,
Right.
they want to make sure there's still open, competitive bidding.
Okay.
So it's not just set-asides for small businesses.
Right. Okay.
Fourth, for the risk of lower quality,
Yeah.
even with the faster purchases, they're going to implement basic quality checks.
Okay.
So we don't sacrifice quality for speed.
Makes sense.
And finally, to handle the potential overload for contracting officers,
Right.
they're going to invest in more training and potentially hire more people.
Okay. Okay. So that all sounds like, logical steps to try and stay ahead of those potential problems.
Yeah.
So who in the DoD is going to be most, directly affected by these changes? Because the document mentions DoD personnel most affected.
The folks who are doing acquisition are going to feel this the most, right?
Right.
Contracting officers will be managing much bigger transactions under these, simplified rules, so they're going to need new training and skills.
Right.
Acquisition staff, in general, might see their jobs change.
Okay.
Maybe they'll be doing more oversight, risk management,
Right.
implementing these new streamlined processes for these larger purchases
Okay.
and small business liaisons. They'll probably be a lot busier
Right.
because there'll be all these new opportunities under that $500,000 reservation.
Right. So it's not just people inside the DoD who might have, thoughts or concerns about this.
Right.
The document talks about stakeholders, a poster.
Yes.
So who might be pushing back on this and why?
Well, whenever you're talking about big changes in government spending, there are always people who get worried.
Sure.
So, the folks in Congress who oversee the budget might have reservations.
Yeah.
They might worry about less transparency, less accountability with these higher limits and fewer rules.
Right.
Then you've got the big traditional defense contractors.
Okay.
They might not like this, because they might get fewer contracts
Right.
with this emphasis on small businesses.
Right.
And then even the DoD auditors themselves,
Okay.
they might be worried about how to track and audit these bigger, less regulated transactions.
So it seems like putting all this into action is going to require some investment, right? And the document does mention additional resources needed.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what are we talking about here?
Mostly money.
Okay.
The DoD will have to spend money on those better audit tools
Right.
we talked about and training for all the people involved in acquisition.
Right.
And they might even need to hire more people to handle all this.
So how will they know if these changes are actually working?
Well, they've got some specific goals, some measures of success.
Okay.
They want to cut the time it takes to complete a purchase by 20%,
Okay.
which gets to that idea of being faster, right?
Right.
They want to increase the value of contracts going to small businesses by 15%.
Okay.
And they want to keep cost overruns below 5% every year.
So those are pretty clear benchmarks.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the document mentions alternative approaches that were considered. Like, what else did they think about doing besides these big threshold increases?
So two main things. One was to look for updated guidance, training, any new procedures they put out,
Okay.
and pay attention to the risks we talked about.
Right.
Oversight, budget tracking, competition, quality, all that.
Right.
And know what the DoD is doing to mitigate those risks.
Okay.
If you work with small businesses, this is a big opportunity.
Right.
Understand how to make the most of it.
Okay.
And for those who aren't directly involved in DoD procurement,
Right.
but are still interested in defense,
Yeah.
small businesses, government efficiency,
Yeah.
this gives you context,
Okay.
insight into the DoD's priorities, how they're modernizing,
Right.
the trade-offs between speed and oversight.
Right.
Keep an eye on the news, government reports.
Okay.
Look at those measures of success, procurement timelines, small business contracts, cost overruns.
Okay. So they can see how it's all playing out in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay. So to summarize our deep dive,
Yeah.
Section 307 of the Forged Act is a big deal.
Big deal.
It's about changing how the DoD buys things, making it faster, more opportunities for small businesses.
Yep.
But it's not without risks.
Right?
And the DoD is working on ways to address those.
Right.
This deep dive, this look at this specific recommendation from the Forged Act is really just the beginning.
Yeah.
We'll keep exploring this and other parts of the Act in future deep dives.
Exactly.
So as these changes take effect across the DoD, here's a question to think about.
Okay.
How will this balance between speed and oversight actually affect defense innovation, the companies involved, and how efficiently the government spends money?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
And worth thinking about.
It is, and it's going to be fascinating to watch it all play out. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.